Welcome to Exploration Arcanum. My name is Jason. In this conversation with author, speaker, publisher, and television host Mitch Horowitz, we explore his journey into the esoteric, tracing the influences that shaped his path. We also discuss the intersection of quantum mechanics and magic, the New Thought movement, the implications of positive thinking, and his work on the series Alien Encounters, Fact or Fiction, and the Unbelievable with Dan Aykroyd. Mitch also shares insights into his upcoming projects, including his new book Practical Magick and a forthcoming book on ESP. I want to thank Mitch for coming on the show. I'll link Mitch's social media and websites in the description below. If you enjoy this conversation, please consider liking it. It really helps the channel. Also, if you would like to support Exploration Arcanum further, please consider subscribing and becoming a patron on Patreon. Thank you.
Casting circles beneath the midnight sky, incantations beneath the shadows.
Well, Mitch, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. I can't tell you how much it means to be sitting across from you like this. You're one of my favorite esoteric writers and speakers, and it just means a lot that you said okay to come on the show.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. It's great to be here with you. I've always dug our exchanges over interviews, and we go from one dimensions to two dimensions, soon to three dimensions. So here
That's
we are.
right.
Yeah.
Well, let's get right into it because I think a lot of your work has gone on for years. I want to say at least 20 that you've been writing books on the
Sure.
occult and esoterica.
Yeah, I think that's about right. My first book came out in 2009, but that was preceded by articles and talks. So I think about 20 years is right. Yeah.
Well, how did you get interested in the esoteric? Like, what was your aha moment?
Well, I was always interested in the subject when I was a kid. I grew up in the town of Belrose in Queens, in the city of New York, and I would take out books of folklore and mythology from the local public library. I remember occult and esoteric topics were very much in the air. My sister would come home with paperbacks from the Arrow Book Club on Bigfoot and flying saucers and the books of Carlos Castaneda. And I was particularly interested, as I still am, in how certain ideas from what I suppose could be called deep or primeval antiquity survived as retentions, at least, in our own modern era. Like astrology, for example. I would buy little horoscope scrolls from a machine that uh, was in the lobby of our local diner. You would put in a dime and you could get out a little star scroll. And of course, I was interested in the veracity of the material, but I was also interested in how these sigils that had their earliest origins in ancient Mesopotamia could have survived and shown up in Queens. And it's fascinating to me how most people walking around today, almost anywhere in the world, would know their sun sign and something of the details surrounding it, whether or not they attributed any belief to it whatsoever. And of course, a rejectionist would say, well, that's just tribute to the perpetual gullibility of the human race. I say something otherwise. I mean, we no longer bleed ourselves with leeches or engage in other practices from late antiquity or the Middle Ages, for that matter. But topics like astrology or even questions of belief surrounding the extra-physical that are today actually leaping dramatically ahead, validated by people who are using quantum computers, at least as reasonable questions. Where is this information coming from? Which is not an idle question. And the closer you get to the quantum, it used to be we would only talk about that in physics. Now we're talking about that in computers. The more and more it becomes clear that we haven't box checked all the facets of reality. And this stuff fascinated me as a child, and I retained that fascination into adulthood. Um, I went through a series of, I think you could just call them accidents in adulthood, where I wound up taking a job as an editor at the New Age imprint of a publishing company, which was then called Penguin, is now called Penguin Random House. And that turn of events, which at the time was accidental. I was rebounding from a job in which I had been fired. I got my dream job. Everybody said, "You're in your dream job." Always be very cautious when people use that phrase. And 2 years into my dream job, I was fired and needing work. I took a job as an editor at this imprint that put out New Age and metaphysical books. And I thought, well, look, I was interested in this as a kid. My interest in questions, both political, spiritual, and philosophical, is far-reaching. So say yes. And so I received an open door and I walked through it. And it awakened me. It reawakened all of these passions that I felt as a child. And I feel very lucky. I mean, I embarked on that part of my career, I guess, in 1997. So that's it's coming up on quite a few years. And I guess I consider myself and anybody greatly fortunate if they discover something in life that reawakens passions they had when they were a kid. So it's funny, I tell you, we go through pain in life and we wish we could reverse it. A bad breakup, a getting fired, an investment that goes sour, not being in proximity to a thing or a person or a place that we want, and we feel remorseful about it, and we feel regretful, and yet it's not infrequent that we look back and say, if I hadn't suffered that switchback in the road, which felt so difficult at the time, look, I wouldn't be having this conversation with you right now.
Mhm. Well, who are your influences? Because I started reading Manly P. Hall's Secret Teaching of All Ages, and I couldn't get through it.
Mhm.
But I was able to get through it after I read your Seeker's Guide to the Secret Teaching of All Ages,
Appreciate
which
it.
I thought was an excellent introduction to that.
Thank you.
But was Manly P. Hall an influence for you, or who would you say were your influences?
Really was an influence. I tend to get very attracted to personas, and then from the persona, I will begin to delve into the work. I'll never forget when I first heard the stately name of Manly P. Hall said to me, something clicked, and I thought, yes, I must know who this is. And this was in the early days of digital culture, and the first thing I did was lay hands on a copy of The Secret Teachings of All Ages, which I was able to buy through Amazon when Jeff Bezos was still living in a split level suburban home, you know, instead of space or wherever Jeff lives nowadays. And I fell in love with it because he showed me that you could pursue the history of esotericism as a true vocation, as a true career path, and that it wasn't some secondary footnote off to the side of Western civilization, but that it was an artery. And I was also attracted by the parapsychology researcher J.B. Rhine, who opened the parapsychology lab at Duke University in the 1930s, who really made parapsychology into an academic science, which it is today by any of the markers that you would use to define something as a science. I define science as methodological replication. We use the term science as if it's the tablets being brought down from Mount Sinai. And the fact is, it's that simple. It's methodological replication. And if you're functioning within that framework, you're in the pursuit of science, whether or not your hypothesis comes up a positive or null or any number of other possibilities. Um, and so it was really J.B. Rhine that became, I would say, arguably even more so than Manly Hall, an enormous influence on me because there was such an intellectual solidity to Rhine. He was exploring the question of gathering lab-based data for or against the ESP thesis. Are we, as so-called five sensory beings, capable of receiving and conveying information in what might be called an anomalous fashion, a fashion that goes beyond any technologically or sensorially understood technique? And and JB worked painstakingly to establish just a few uh, replicable, methodologically repeatable deviation in percentage points on simple card tests that, in essence, prove the existence of the ineffable. It's really quite that simple. If JB had stopped his work in the mid 1930s, by the time he published his monograph, Extrasensory Perception, in 1934, we would still have sufficient statistical evidence that's been widely replicated in favor of the a non-physical or an extra-physical, I should say, a means of data conveyance. It's almost the God question reduced to a few statistical percentage points. It's that extraordinary and epic in scale, and yet so sober and solid and conservative in methodology. And that's what I loved about J.B. Rhine. He would approach questions that are of an ultimate nature, but he would do so in this profoundly grounded, sober, careful, again, methodological fashion. So he became a big influence on me. Neville Goddard, probably the most adventurous intellect and the most erudite mind to emerge from the New Thought tradition, the tradition that raises the prospect that our thoughts are causative. Neville, who was a British Barbadian mystic who died in 1972, argued that your imagination is the very thing symbolically referenced as God in Scripture, and that every time you see God in Scripture, it's parabolic of the human imagination, and that everything you see and experience, including these words that you and I are speaking right now, is vested in the imagination of the listener. You may have a listener to whom news of all this is current, and I would say to that listener, according to Neville Goddard's philosophy, there's no Mitch, there's no Jason, there's only you. We're simply figments of your intellect, your psyche, your emotionalized thoughts, and we are mere figments through which these ideas, i.e., your ideas, speaking to the listener, are reaching you. And Neville argued for this with such elegance, and he created the most elegant mystical analog to quantum theory. He said things in 1948 that didn't become part of the scientific vocabulary until the mid to late 1950s in terms of the many worlds theory, in terms of the capacity to measure and thereby localize different events within the paradigm of quantum mechanics. And Neville made a statement to students in 1948 in LA. Scientists will someday explain why there is a serial universe, but our intent presently is how to use it. And he uttered something that would have been at home in terms of the formulation of the many worlds theorem that was articulated by physicist Hugh Everett III in 1957. And Neville was speaking this way almost 10 years earlier. So he became a big influence. And it's funny, we're exiting a phase of our culture right now where quantum mechanics, in terms of particle physics, became popularized, and then critics yelled foul and pushed back against the popularization. And now the topic is expanding into finance, as I'm sure you encounter in your work, and there are banks, hedge funds, financial institutions that are speaking as ingenuously about the prospect of many worlds, multiple dimensions, a serial universe to explain the impossible realities that we're seeing right now in the very nascence of quantum computing. The operations that are being performed in quantum computing are impossible according to our understandings of the arrow of time and the limits of time and the
Which is
capacity. to grasp knowledge within the framework that we understand. We're seeing answers to problems that under even super fast hypercomputing in a different world would have taken more time than humanity is projected to even exist, and yet we get the answer in 10 minutes. This is as real as the words I'm speaking. So the question of quantum data is making all of this stuff that used to seem fuzzy and mystical and squishy cutting edge. It hasn't reached academia. It hasn't reached most of journalism. It's reached what you're doing because you are reporting from this edge. And most editors on Wikipedia, most mainstream journalists, most academics in the social sciences, not the hard sciences, would think this was all just frou-frou nonsense, but what's coming out of investment banks.
Right.
So forgive me, that's a bit tangential to your question, but I would say that the chief influences I had intellectually included Manly P. Hall, Neville, J.B. Rhine, also the mystical philosopher G.I. Gurdjieff, but in a different way. But those are my chief influences.
Are you speaking of quantum computers? Because that I like you said, I researched that in my work, and one of the things that recently came up was that quantum computers have proven that the multiverse exists. And it, to me, spoke to how a lot of people said that magic was science that wasn't discovered or wasn't given a proper name yet. Do you agree with that?
Well, um, there are so many different forms of magic. It seems to me that some of them are legitimate hacks into our world, using a sort of 90s term, but it seems newly relevant today because if we are living in this multi-layered reality in which all events are a simultaneity and everything is infinite, it seems to me that maybe certain aspects of magic break the code at certain moments or create a glitch. And certain aspects of all human practice, I guess I'll put it this way, everything occurs on a scale. And you might have practices from magical tradition, including really primeval tradition, that we look back on and can defend as valid. Other things that are kind of better left on the cutting room floor, so to speak. But there's clearly evidence of that. I was just thinking back last night on a report that hasn't received enough attention. I'm sure you know of it, where Bank of America told its investors in 2016 that there's something like between a 30 and 50% chance that we're living in a simulation.
Right. I saw that.
And like, oh, okay. And, how about those free pens you people think are such a mind-boggling statement that we really can't digest it. And yet the simulation argument is so rational and so logical and so persuasive that there's no denying its possibilities. Its
Right.
possibilities as a matter of forensics. In fact, the gentleman who pioneered simulation theory. His name escapes me, so forgive me, but he made such a compelling statement to the effect that if you wish to rule out what I'm describing, then you have no means of espousing the opinion that humanity will someday be capable of multi, if not infinite, simulations.
Right.
And of course, almost no one would cop to that position. Um, but if you want to hold that position, the fee of entry to it is the acknowledgement that we could be the product of one, the figment of one. So,
Right.
is it possible, speaking to your question about magic of yesterday becoming science of today, I'm very interested in the mind causation thesis, or what colloquially is called the positive thinking, we'll
Mhm.
call it.
Uh,
Uh, it seems very pedestrian, but is that a hack into the matrix?
well, and I'm glad you brought up the positive thinking because I was looking at that and forgive me if I'm getting the term wrong, but it's called free thought.
Oh, new thought, new
New
thought.
thought, new thought, new thought. All right. And so from what I could gather from what I read, and please correct me if I'm wrong, it's similar to in the if you have what you say type thing that gets that gets taught in church. Like when I grew up in church, one of the things was that you have to be careful what you say because what you say becomes reality,
Mhm.
essentially.
What church did you attend? What denomination was it?
Oh, non-denominational. It was
Oh,
just like,
non-denominational,
yeah.
because that's a rather liberal, concept to hear espoused, but I agree with it. Yeah.
Yeah, so what we were taught was you don't say things like
Mm.
I'm sick, because if you say you're sick, you're going to be sick. If
Mm.
you say you're healthy, you're going to be healthy because you're proclaiming it. And that's what I got when I was looking into to what you're referring to. And is it similar to that?
Yes, yes, it is. And there are different levels in which it's practiced. There's a different scale. I mean, I would say on the intellectual scale, Neville ranks far and away the highest. And then there's plenty of figures who fall much, 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 much lower. Um, the New Thought world, which teaches that thoughts are things, thoughts are causative, it's burdened, it seems to me, with a very childish intellectual culture. It hasn't grown, I would say, since William James died in 1910, although I have to take that back because Neville, I think, helped the field to grow, but he died in 72, so we're still talking a couple of generations ago.
Right.
Uh, and the philosophy, the positive mind philosophy, is absolutely reviled within most of American letters, within most of mainstream journalism, and within most of the social sciences, where it is considered the ultimate panacea of of kind of buying off people into this fairy tale, airsat spiritual fantasy
Right.
instead of getting down to the business of the real economic forces that impact on our lives. And this is an argument with very familiar political implications. And it's considered to be victim blaming as well, because, well, if you tell Mike that he has a cold because he thought he had a cold, that's unspeakable. And all the intellectuals have their box checks as to why they revile this philosophy. But for the fact that its modern founders displayed a remarkable instinct for human nature as well as things that we're experiencing right now in actuality, like in the field of neuroplasticity, for example, whereby the pattern through which electrical impulses are travel in the brain are alterable based on the nature of our sustained thoughts.
Right.
What is a thought? We don't even know what a thought is. We use AI all the time. We don't know what intelligence is, what a thought is. Is it strictly local? Well, most of the aforementioned constituencies would say, of course, it's strictly local. A thought is the equivalent of bubbles in a carbonated glass of water. And once the water is gone, the bubbles are gone. And, we all know that, except for the New Age lunatics like Horowitz. But the fact is, of course, that thesis no longer holds up, not only in terms of um, quantum computing seizing answers that go outside of our actual framework of projectable, not projected, but projectable reality in terms of how much time we as human beings have left on this planet. And it would take more time than that to get certain answers that reach us in 10 minutes, raising this question of whether there exist different intersections of time. But in fact, in the field of neuroplasticity itself, we're seeing literal mind over matter on a biological level. This genie cannot be rebottled, and it doesn't mean that the most vulgar expressions of positive mind philosophy, everybody likes to piss on The Secret, which is now many years old, and one of many such expressions. People who piss on it haven't seen it or read it, by the way, because it doesn't have a Mercedes Benz in it or any of the things that they say is present in it, but another topic for another time. But the fact is, there are vulgar expressions which I discourage, just as I would discourage misuse of drugs or misuse of credit or staying up all night and being an idiot and being unable to go to work the next day. I mean, again, scale. We have to approach everything with a question of scale. So there's an upper and a lower end to the positive mind um, thesis. And I think there's instinct there, and it may be a hack into the matrix that we're only coming to terms with in our generation.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the because a question that I've always had about that is what happens when two conflicting positive thoughts hit. For example, if you want it, say we're both, I'm going to win the lottery. Well, we both can't win the lottery at the same time. So,
Right.
what happens when those two positive thoughts conflict? Does that cause any broader issues?
I think there's a wonderful question there, and I would answer it on two different levels. Um, on one level, there may be no conflict because in this um, proposed serial universe or multidimensional world of total simultaneity in which we live, we may be creating a past sense of past, present, future at every instant. And that sense may be completely real. If I asked you where you were from, you might say, well, I grew up in Nevada and, dad was an MD and mom did this and blah, blah. And that is all absolutely real and true and provable. And it may be something that we are all recreating at one instant from another, just like the localization of a particle creates a whole past, present, and future for that particle that would be entirely different if somebody coughed and waited a moment to click on the photometer. And this is literally true. We face these implications. So it could be that on a psychological level or a psychical level, those implications are as real for us as they are for anybody taking measurement anywhere in the world in a lab. We actualize via perspective. Another way of looking at it might be that we do live within the framework of familiar laws and forces in this world, and that there are people who have and have not, and there are all kinds of reasons for that. One of which may have something to do with this thought causation thesis, but there's other laws and forces playing out: social, physical, geographical, accidental. I hate the expression "there are no accidents." I always feel that's sort of shifting to a default. I don't even like when we Westerners use expressions like karma too quick and easily, because they're just vocabulary terms like consciousness. We don't really know what it is, and it fills in blanks rather than leaving us in a sense of questioning. Um, I do think that some of the vociferous critics of the positive mind thesis um, proceed from the question that you're very rightly raising, which is, are you saying that there's this inevitable framework of winners and losers in our world based on who is mentally more capable of entering a feeling state and winning the lottery or something else? And I understand their concerns. I don't quite view it that way because I think there are so many myriad laws and forces. The guy who won the lottery could slip in his bathtub tomorrow and die. And it might be for reasons that are very mundane.
Well, I wanted to speak with you about your books, because one of the books that I have that I didn't know that you were actually involved with was the latest publication of the Kybalion. And
Oh, yes.
I have that, and what made me think about it was I because I bought the documentary first,
Oh.
and then I got the Kybalion because the documentary was interesting. But what led you to down the Kybalion path?
Well, it's funny. When I was at Penguin years ago, I got very interested in the early works of the new metaphysics, most of which is based in New Thought. And one of the works I came upon was the Kybalion, and I read it and I did not like it. I thought, as many of its critics think, although they will be more vociferous than I'm about to be, I thought it was just New Thought draped in pseudo-Egyptian costumery, and that's it. And I thought it had some perfectly serviceable points if one took seriously the new metaphysics, the positive mind metaphysics that were so popular at that time. But otherwise, it was an act of costume play, pretending that this was a hermetic work. I knew from various copyright searches that it was written singularly by William Walker Atkinson, the mysterious, the man behind the mysterious bylines of Magus Incognito, Theron Q. Dumont, Three Initiates.
Okay.
Yogi Ramasharka. And the book held no interest for me really beyond that. And then I was speaking to the philosopher Jacob Needleman, who died several years ago, and I voiced to him the same opinion that I just did to you. And he got a little bit of a gleam in his eye, and he said to me, "You know, there are some good ideas in that little book." And so I thought, all right, this is strange. And I went back to the book. And at the same time, this is going to sound funny, but sometimes life is funny. I learned through a friend, Philip Desley, who's a scholar of American religion, that the Kybalion had been the favorite of a comedic actor who some of your listeners will remember, named Sherman Hemsley, who played the famous George Jefferson, the Jeffersons. And the Jeffersons was so popular at one time, it was the most popular show in America for 3 or 4 years running. And there was a profile of Hemsley as an actor on the cover of TV Guide magazine, which was also a very big magazine. And there was a painting of Hemsley that looked like it was done by Leroy Neiman, the expressionist sports painter. It was a very nice painting. And it said, it said something like, "The Secret Life of Sherman Hemsley. You never believe how he lives or what he practices or something." And he very obliquely in the interview, very obliquely referenced the Kybalion, and he told the reporter said to him, "How did you make the leap from stage to television?" And Hemsley said, "I met the man with the book, and then everything changed." And the reporter said, "What book?" And then Hemsley, in classic George Jefferson style, said, "I don't want to advertise any book." And he wouldn't tell him the title. He wouldn't tell him the title. But he had a housemate named Andre Pavone. And the reporter interviewed the housemate as well. And Andre confirmed to him, it's the Kybalion.
Hmm.
And they talked about it a little bit. And he was willing to be open where Hemsley wasn't. And I don't know. I was attracted by that because so many people are eager to announce their beliefs. And here was Helmsley conceding, "Yeah, I'm into this mystical book, but I won't tell you what it is because I'm not trying to I'm not trying to be a spokesman for anything." And anyway, long story short, I went back to the thing. I read it 4 or 5 times consecutively in one summer. And I came to feel that Needleman was correct and Helmsley was correct, that there's stuff in there. And when you have Jacob Needleman and Sherman Helmsley agreeing, take a second look. And no, there was truth. I felt that Atkinson as an author did an energetic job of combining certain Hermetic themes with certain New Thought themes. And there's an elegance and there is a suppleness and there's a beauty to some of what he did that I think I had overlooked the first time. And again, the Kybalion meets with such invective online today. You would think that this is one of the key problems in our world, right up there with poverty and lack of potable drinking water, the Kybalion. And it's just people get so over caffeinated about it. It is a spiritual novelty. It is a modern work. It is a pseudonymous work. And yes, Atkinson clipped and pasted from people who came before him, as many occult writers do, as many historical writers, and as we're finding science people and lots of people do who are having their papers get, discredited right now. He did some of that, but he created something that I think was a lasting and sensitive novelty. And the book has been meaningful to me.
When you're looking at books like the Kybalion, another one that comes to mind is Emerald Tablets. When you look at these books, and like you said, that there's little pieces of the Kybalion that are very useful, do you sometimes see a book and you're just like, oh my God, how did this get published?
I do. Sometimes some of the channeled literature that exists in our world today seems like such a um, warmed over variant of the basic New Thought thesis. But I suppose people we need novelties. We need adventurous claims to venture an idea, even if that idea has been around for a very long time, and there might be better places of imbibing it. I will meet people sometimes who will express to me what a life-changing experience they had reading a certain channeled book. and I'll say, "Oh boy, well, I got to check it out." And I'll read the book, and I'll find that it seems like, yesterday's, muffins being offered at half price at the bakery, and it's okay, but it's very, very familiar. But we all have our own tastes and our own sense of adventure, and stuff just sometimes has to reach us in a certain way. There's books I actively don't like. I don't like the 48 Laws of Power, for example. I don't like its lack of ethics. I don't like its lack of honor. I don't like um, encouraging people to take credit for work that they haven't done, or to, mind fuck colleagues. I've had it done to me. I'm sure lots of people listening have, and I disapprove of it. So there's books I don't like, although I'll acknowledge their quality. And then there's books that, yeah, once in a while I'll just scratch my head. I'll find something so boring. I feel like I'm drunk when I'm reading it, like I can't get past a certain line. I'm just so profoundly uninteresting. And yet for some people it opens a door.
Now, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about your work on television.
Mhm.
So, one of the shows that you co-host is Alien Encounters: Fact versus Fiction, Fact or Fiction. For
Fact, no question mark, curiously enough. But you know,
how did that show come together? Because I've gone through some of your older work, and I don't recall much on aliens. How did that land in your lap?
unexpectedly, um, I started writing some about aliens in 2017, 2018, where I started applying the interdimensional thesis to the UFO question. And I'm certainly not original in having done that. That was a path trailed much earlier by Jacques Vallée. But I felt like it needed a new sounding in our era where these discussions of the quantum are coming much more to the forefront. So I started writing about it, but it was not an area of focus. It came to me because I've worked in television for many, many years, and I've had the wish to host a show for many, many years. And as anybody who's worked in TV knows, the development process is absolute. I've described it as living hell capped by crushing disappointment. I mean, nothing gets out of the development process. I was joking with Whitley Strieber the other day, who I've known for quite a long time, and whose books I've published. Um, that I can statistically prove that nothing ever gets made. And so after years of slaving through the development process, which is a terrible process, um, I was approached to be part of a show that was already leaving the station. The train was leaving the station, so to speak. And this was, I guess it was late December, early January. Maybe it was late December, going back a year. Um, and and I was approached about the show, and I happened to have been in LA at the time, and the casting producer was in LA, and we got together, and we had known one another before, and had some history through Manly Hall's organization, and boom, 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 it came together so quickly in weeks. And by late February, I'm there in Roswell, New Mexico, on set shooting. And this is after, you know, another commensurate project might have puttered on for 2 years in development before dying out. It's strange how life will bring you the thing that you need in a very different way from your mind's eye. And I felt convinced that if it hadn't been for all the it's not vain effort, if it hadn't been for all the payment and the suffering and the effort that I invested up to that point, I would not have reached that point. I can guarantee it.
And which one of, if someone wanted to read your work on aliens and interdimensional, what book would you recommend they look at?
The book I would recommend is Uncertain Places, because the first chapter of that book, which is called Reclaiming the Damned, is an essay on the question of applying the interdimensional model to cryptozoology and UFOs.
Okay.
And my ideas have expanded more and more and more along those lines, but that was the first place where I had explored it.
Gotcha. And now your upcoming book is called Practical Magic. And tell me a little bit about that. What does that book explore, and who would you say it's for?
I would say the book it can be for anybody interested in the practice of magic, whether they are a newcomer or a veteran. And it was inspired because as I was writing my previous book, Modern Occultism,
Mhm.
I came upon passages that were written by the occultist Jack Parsons shortly before his death at a very young age. And Jack, who had been through everything, had experienced betrayal from L. Ron Hubbard, betrayal from um,
Your
his
wife.
paramours, betrayal from Aleister Crowley. He said, he wrote to his wife, Marjorie Cameron, um, every idea war in history that's been won has been won through simplicity. And at this point, magic does not have it. And Jack felt that we needed to simplify the magical process. And that was one part of my inspiration. Another part of my inspiration was I came to learn and read about this in very mainstream scholarly sources that it's hard to speak of this because it's such true primeval history. We speak of the pre-human story as being prehistory. In other words, our Neanderthal ancestors. Our Neanderthal ancestors, who strictly speaking, they weren't Homo sapiens. They weren't human. I mean, they were a lot like us, different gait, different cranium, different um, height. They weren't like us exactly, but they were very, very, very close. Homo neanderthalis is not the same as Homo sapiens, and yet these beings who predate us on this planet, and to whom we presumably at some point um, uh, mated with, and the human race, or what we call the human race, at some point began. They had a spirituality. We have found, and this has been true since the mid 19th century, not very long ago, really, we have found that they collected what we today would call talismans,
Mhm.
like an eagle claw, eagle talon, or a bear claw, which might have been worn, just like I'm wearing a talisman right now. Jesus Malverde, Angel of the Poor. And I have several others. They fell off. I have them in my pocket. They usually run. Anyway, and in addition to that, Neanderthal men and women crafted little figurines about 4 inches high, which archaeologists in the mid 19th century termed Venus figurines, obviously using a Victorian term that wouldn't have applied to beings tens of thousands of years old. But these Venus figurines, so called, they're feminine forms, very large, kind of bulbous, round forms, large pendulous breasts, large bellies, looking nothing like our Neanderthal ancestors who lived on a subsistence diet. And the presumption is that these were fertility figurines, that this is a pregnant figure. Um, and the notion that Neanderthal men and women, these our pre-human ancestors, dwelling in a period that we consider prehistory, the last of them are presumed to have died out around 40,000 years ago. It's hard to even speak of such figures. And in terms of our, existence on this planet, the last of whom died out about 40,000 years ago. The fact that they would have things that we would, at least hypothetically, recognize as talismans and statuettes and things of that nature, um, it suggests something about spirituality's universalism, its profound universalism, that it's not just a dopamine hit or social conditioning, but it must be something very deeper because these beings who lived in a world where everything had to be utilitarian and real and useful, it was a subsistence hunter-gatherer culture of survival. You didn't really have time for things that didn't have utility, and that these beings, our ancestors, our eldest known ancestors, had a spirituality as much as we can understand, was very touching to me. And between Jack's call for simplicity and the realization that these ancients, these pre-ancients, had a spirituality, I wonder if there was a way of returning to what I call in the book a kind of magical primitivism and stripping away some of the complexities, which can become so thick in magic, ceremonies and rites and rituals and liturgies, just like in religion, depending on where you come from,
Right.
and getting down to the barest, most essential basics. That's what I attempt in the book,
Mhm.
along with history, because I like people to know, kind of where I'm coming from, and explore these things with proper references and notes.
And Parsons is probably one of my favorite occultists. Just
I
um,
love it. I
I
love
grew
it.
I grew up near Pasadena,
Oh,
and so the spirit of Jack Parsons has always been hovering around.
how
Uh,
wonderful.
I went to JPL for an assignment last year,
Oh,
and it's funny. It depends on who you ask as to how involved he was with the right. Like if they liked him, he was right there with everybody else. If they hated him,
right, right, right.
if
You
they
know,
hated him, he didn't even come on these grounds.
I think the thing I love about Jack is not just that a lot of weird things happened to him, which they certainly did, but he was a first-class intellect and he was a very sincere man. And, Crowley damned him as naive and foolish. Well, I don't know. I mean, I guess Crowley would have said the same thing about me. Jack was trusting, and that may be a weakness, but in people, trusting people, they project their own traits onto others.
Right.
And we all have to watch out for that because those of us who behave with honor, we project that onto other people and we think that they're going to deal fairly just as we do. And then you get the unpleasant surprise of your life. Happens, happened to Jack.
Yeah.
But I think he was a really ethical intellect and a first-rate intellect. And I think he found things. And I'm sorry he died so soon, but he inspired me, across a span of 75 years.
Yeah, and it would be interesting to see what he would have gotten up to if he had have lived, especially like into more modern times.
You
I mean,
imagine
can you imagine him on the internet?
Jack with quantum computing? I told you so. You see, you people
See?
trying to get across.
All right. Well, Mitch, thank you so much for joining me today. What's next? Where do you have any speaking engagements? Are you coming out west anytime soon?
Well, let's see. I am coming out west, but to another country. I'm going to be in Vancouver, Canada in July, speaking at a Theosophical World Congress. I'm going to be speaking about the India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, who I have a picture of up in, if anybody can see me.
Yeah. Right?
He's a great hero to me because he took the helm of India after Gandhi's death, and he labored intensively to transform India into a religiously tolerant nation that had been previously riven by religion, Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, Buddhists, and he tried to craft a government that was indifferent to religion and hence um, protecting of freedom of religion.
Right.
The very indifference that he tried to bring to government would have given everybody a stake in it without feeling like, oh, well, this guy's a Hindu, so he's going to favor the Hindus. And Nehru's a very important figure to me. So I'll be speaking about him in Vancouver in July. I'm just starting a new book called The Sixth Sense about the question of ESP and its practical utility, if it has one, in day-to-day life. Doing a lot of television. Just finished recording season 3 of The Unbelievable. I beg your pardon, season 2 of The Unbelievable with Dan Aykroyd on History Channel, and that's been a pleasure because I think that show hit its stride in the second season. Just recorded a show for History Channel called The Proof Is Out There, and next week there's an occult-themed crime that's the subject of a new miniseries by an Emmy nominated director, which I can't fully talk about yet, but I'm going to be recording something for that next week. So, not a lot of sleep, a lot of caffeine, staying busy.
Nice. All right. Well, Mitch, thank you so much for taking the time. I truly, truly appreciate it.
Casting circles beneath the midnight sky. Incantations beneath the shadow.